For those that haven't met me, my name is Anthony Harnden. I've been a professor of primary care in the Department of Primary Care Health Sciences for a number of years, and have worked 40 years for the NHS, including nearly 35 as a GP. So really, I'm here as a warm-up act to Joseph, but I would like to tell you a little bit about it from a GP perspective as well as a regulatory perspective. We at the MHRA are taking these growing use of direct-to-consumer medical tests very, very seriously. A number of issues that arise from them. And when I think back to my time in general practice, and I'm sure some of you GPs in the audience will recognise this, many of the people that come to see us have symptoms which really we never fully explain. And it's not unusual because we all experience aches, pains and uncertainties in our bodies. And understandably, we want answers to this. What has changed now, though, is that to get these answers, people either go direct to Google, direct to AI, ordering tests through the post and things. So we're in a position, actually, often as GPs, where people are coming in with the answers before we can actually advise them what the true cause of their symptoms are. AI is giving us quite a lot of problems in the MHRA in terms of healthcare regulation. We have set up an AI commission to look at this issue in great depth. We hope that we're going to become one of the international leads in AI healthcare regulation in the country, but I can explain that either informally or at another talk. But in terms of performance tests, we really need to set these tests in context. They're often being used in moments of anxiety, as I say, or uncertainty outside a clinical pathway and without support that usually comes from with medical testing. And Annika, I think, summed it up really well. It's not just the performance of the test, the sensitivity or the specificity of the test, but the context. The positive predictive value of any test, as she rather eloquently illustrated, depends on the prevalence in the population. And that a test can have very high sensitivity and specificity, but very poor performance in a particular context. Let me give you a couple of examples. PSA testing, at home or over-the-counter PSA testing is now becoming quite common. And people use it as a definitive answer for prostate cancer. But we know as clinicians that a raised PSA can have multiple causes, including infection, benign prostate enlargement, prostate, as well as cancer. So on its own and without clinical context and outside a national screening system, it can cause unnecessary alarm or false reassurance. So from a regulatory perspective, we're very clear. These particular PSA tests must not claim to detect prostate cancer, and any positive result should always be followed up with a healthcare professional. Another example, for instance, and many of your GPs will be aware of this, people go for these various BUPA tests or private tests and things that come up with a raised serum rhubarb or a raised serum ferritin is quite a common one, actually. I've seen patients come in with ferritin results that they've actually ordered themselves, some only slightly abnormal, but causing huge amount of anxiety. So context is everything, and interpretation in isolation by patients can be very misleading. So I think we need to ask questions as a regulator about direct consumer tests. 3 key questions. What do the results actually mean? How are people interpreting risk? And who holds that data and how is it used? So we're really watching this closely. The use of over-the-counter and at-home tests is expanding rapidly, and probably rightly so in many ways, but because they can support awareness and prompt people to seek advice earlier, but they must meet the right standards. And this means clear regulatory requirements are placed on the market before they're placed on the market. Robust evidence of safety and performance, and most importantly, I think, clear and accurate information to the public about what the test can and cannot do. Manufacturers have a key role here, not only in developing these tests, but ensuring that they are understood appropriately. And there's a broader issue around trust and continuity of care. So medicine, I think, isn't just simply about generating results. It's really about interpretation, context, continuity, and over time within a trusted relationship. If testing sits outside that system, there's a risk that people are left to interpret complex information on their own, and this can only increase anxiety, drive unnecessary follow-up, and ultimately trust in the healthcare system. So these tests need to sit alongside and not replace clinical advice and interpretation. That's very much our view at the MHRA. We'll continue to strengthen our approach in this particular area as it continues to evolve, and make sure that innovation is matched by safety and public trust, and that is what we are about as an organisation. So I think that's enough of an introduction for me as a warm-up act. My expert is here, Joseph Burt, who I'm really delighted to introduce. He's Head of Diagnostics and General Medical Devices at the MHRA, which he's held this role since 2022. And before joining the agency, Joseph, you developed several in vitro diagnostic medical devices yourself, including the approval of the developed devices within multiple regulatory jurisdictions, and he's currently leading the medical device regulations reform in the UK. And Joseph is one of my great employees. He's one of the happiest. He's got the biggest smile in the MHRA, yes. And I'm sure you'll be very interested to listen to his talk. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was an incredible introduction, Anthony. Thank you so much. I've got my trusty astronomical laser pointer. Hopefully you can see it. So I wanted to just say one word before we start off, and the word of the day is standard. Everyone say it? Standard. Good, thank you. So the answer to every question will be the word standard. Okay, so let's just talk a bit about direct-to-consumer testing and what they really mean from a regulatory point of view. So from a simple layman's language, direct-to-consumer tests are kits that are offered commercially by these organizations direct to members of the public or to customers. That would be you and I. We're all customers. We go into Boots, don't we? We go into Superdrug and Tesco, and we will go and buy the tests in those shelves. So anyone who is buying a test off the shelves from these commercial organizations are direct-to-consumer tests. So they can include over-the-counter self-tests, ferritin tests, PSA tests, ovulation tests. The list goes on. You go and have a look at go to Tesco tonight or Asda. Go and have a look at the shelves full of tests available. Go back and have a read what they all say. So anything where a sample is taken and the testing is done by you at home is a over-the-counter self-test. It's a simple first-level test. Second type of test is you take a sample at home and then you send it off to a laboratory. So you will take like a blood sample, urine sample, hair sample, saliva sample, the list goes on. You will take that, you pop it into a tube, you put it into the mailbox, and it will go into a laboratory for testing. That is also a direct-to-consumer test. Third one is not as common yet in the United Kingdom, but it is being offered at some pharmacies and chemists, is where the chemist or the pharmacist goes behind, takes a sample from you, and then they'll send that off to the particular laboratory where that test will then be undertaken, and you get the result back through a telephone call sometimes, through an app, or through our website that's typically available when you're going off to see the pharmacist. So these are three types of very generic consumer tests, and please just remember the variations of that. But I'm going to talk about regulation. Because regulation is what is the basis to make sure all these types of tests that we have today are going to be of a certain standard. Thank you. So here's what the regulation says. So the regulation says an in vitro diagnostic medical device is a medical device that could be a kit, an instrument, an equipment that is used in vitro for the examination of specimens, and it includes the specimen receptacles itself. Please don't worry about these other bits, these are much more legal terms, that's really important. Just read the red text. A IVD, that's the generic name for an in vitro diagnostic test. A subcategory of that in the regulations is a self-test. Okay? And that could be in the form of a kit, an instrument, an equipment. So you might have some equipment at home that you have to take with you. But it also includes those receptacles that I talked about that takes your hair sample and from your particular urine sample or from a buccal swab from your cheek. Okay, so everyone understand that is what the regulation says. So just read the red text, okay? So to make sure that we all follow the same set of regulations, we have markings that help us. So you've probably seen this mark. Does anyone know what this mark is? The CE mark. I don't know what it means. What does the CE mark mean? Please don't say standard, that's the wrong answer. Conformity certification to European standards, yes. It doesn't actually say what it says, what it means. It just says conformity European, that's the CE mark. Not to standards, actually. It's a mark to allow for the free movement of that product that one member state allows for another member state to recognize. It's a mark of recognition. It is not a mark of quality. Please do not take that moving forward. It is a mark of recognition that one country in the member state, for example, in Belgium, can be recognized in another country like France or Germany. Here in the UK, we have this mark over here, and that's the UKCA mark. The UKCA mark is conformity to the UK requirements, and you'll see them often side by side. Specimen receptacle like here on the left-hand side of the screen, and then they'll have the word IVD next to it. What is a type of IVD? It's a self-test, including a receptacle. This is a standard aliquot receptacle. Behind these two marks are certain sets of regulations that apply. Here in the United Kingdom, we have, I've taken the wrong slide. I've given you the clinical trials one. Please ignore that, I will correct that before the distribution. It should say here the UK medical device regulations, not the clinical trials regulations. I can't believe I didn't spot that before I sent it to you. But in the EU, it has a very similar set of regulations. It's the in vitro diagnostics medical device regulations that apply. It's 2017-746. That's the number of the regulation. The number in front of it is the year it was made, and that's the number of the regulation in that year. So as a company that makes self-tests, they will need to comply with these regulations to allow them to place these two marks that allows them to then distribute that product for your use as a customer or a consumer. Behind these regulations, this is what I really wanted to show you. Do you see Medical Device Regulations 2002? It is a statutory instrument. A statutory instrument is a piece of law. It's what we call a secondary piece of law. The primary piece of law is called the Act of Parliament. The Act of Parliament becomes law. The Act allows you to then create secondary legislation. Secondary legislation in simple legal text is called statutory instrument. In layman's terms, we call it regulation. The regulations tell you what you need to do to meet those direct-to-consumer tests. The minimum things that need to be done before that product is released out for use into the marketplace. They're called essential requirements. The word essential is the pivotal word in that sentence. Essential requirements of in vitro diagnostic devices are described in regulation. Here's what it says. It basically says the requirements for a device for self-testing, that is, a direct consumer test, needs to take into account the skills and means available to users and the influence resulting from the variations that can reasonably be anticipated for the user's technique and environment. So self-test at home, that's going to be your home kitchen or maybe your bathroom. There could be other things in that bathroom that could be affected. The technique of the person, so someone who doesn't have a medical background, someone who's elderly, may not be able to use that test as effectively. So all of these considerations need to be considered by the manufacturer of the test. The other one that's really pivotal here is the essential requirement around ensuring that the device is easy to use by the lay user at all stages of the procedure, and to reduce as far as practical the risk of user error in the handling of the device and the interpretation of the results. So Anthony talked about that. We heard it all this afternoon around the interpretation of the results. The important thing around this is a person that needs to know what those results are cannot be someone who just has no knowledge of what they're testing for. So a classic case is that PSA test. We've got lots of those publicly available at the moment. Again, go into your Tesco tonight, have a look at for a PSA test. If it says it will detect cancer, please call me straight away, because it is not correct. It is not the right test for detecting cancer. And it needs to include something like a user control. What's the type of user control you might be asking? So remember during the COVID pandemic, we had the lateral flow strips. Did you remember the T and the C words? The T word is the test line. What's the C word for? Control. And the reason why we ask for control is to make sure that it's available to be seen by the user. And if you didn't see the control line, what happened? You take a different test, because the test didn't work. Yeah, but very good. Right, so that's what the regulation says. There's some practical considerations that need to be taken. I see Claire Davenport in the back of the room. I'm smiling at you, Claire, because she co-wrote this particular article on the screen here. Please take the screen grab. It was mentioned by Sharon earlier. Some really good considerations of the self-test that they discovered had been tested. There's 30 tests that were purchased in the Edgbaston, Birmingham area, and Claire and John and Alex and other colleagues in the University of Birmingham went and evaluated every single instructions for use behind those tests and the interpretations behind that. It's a very interesting reading. It's published in the British Medical Journal. There is another article associated with this as well, so have a look for that too. But some of the practical considerations that need to be considered for all self-tests or direct-to-consumer tests are these three. One, craft a really simple instructions for use that is in lay language. The important thing behind this is there has to be language that everyone can associate themselves with. It can't be in professional language that is going to be mentioned by a laboratory biomedical scientist. That's not the point here. The point is this will need to be read by someone in their home or someone who has no medical background, potentially. Second one is the lay user support. So if there's a problem with the test, who do I call? Let's say Ghostbusters. Please call a number or send an email or go into a chat. This is one that is constantly being forgotten by lots of organizations that offer these direct-to-consumer tests. It is a legal requirement that there is a lay user support to be offered. That includes things like genetic testing. Direct-to-consumer genetic testing needs to interpret the results for the users that are receiving the results. And the last and also quite important one is around mitigating the unintentional errors that can occur. So some of these errors are actually really simple. Tao in the back of the room I met at lunchtime, which is quite an interesting conversation, is looking at human factors engineering. And this is actually what this is trying to identify. What are those errors that could potentially be causing the result or the test or whatever the person is trying to use these tests that could fail? And those human factors need to be considered in the instructions. So if it's simpler to write a diagram of how to take a test, or to run a test, or to interpret the test, do that instead, rather than writing 4 pages of text that no one will ever understand. So looking at the unintentional errors, or looking facilitated through human factors, is pivotal, and that needs to be described quite clearly in the instructions for use. I'd just like to get everyone to become familiar with the requirements. That's really important, because they set the right standards. That's really what regulations are for. It's not to cause burden, or to cause discomfort, or cause issues. It's to understand what the standard says. And the standard is set, at this point, quite low. So that's why we're reforming our regulations. Our regulations date back to 1998. They don't consider things like software products. Back in 1998, we considered aviary blood grouping, HIV, hepatitis, HPV, as some of the more interesting diseases that we need to look at through. These days, the diseases are much more different. So that's why we're reforming these regulations to be much more relevant for today and hopefully for the next 30 years. I certainly will not be at the MHRA in 30 years' time, so I hope that we all can take the benefit of these regulations that we set today. But also the assessment procedure. The assessment procedure is about how these tests are actually going to be executed and interpreted in the right context. Context is pivotal in everything we do around direct-to-consumer testing. So refining the intended purpose statement. Who's read an intended purpose statement? Oh, yeah. Anyone else read it? Yeah. So an intended purpose statement says what you're doing with that test. So what is the medical condition you're trying to detect or diagnose? What is the user population that you're trying to detect for? And the third one is, who's read one before? The environment. The environment in which you're running that test. So for direct consumer tests, it could be at a pharmacy, it could be at home. So the environment, the user population, and what disease you're trying to detect with that test. The intended purpose statement has to be objective and specific. It can't say things like, I will detect or intend to detect all cancers. That is practically impossible. If you can tell me a test that can give me a detection of all cancers, please write to me. I'd be interested to know. I'll start a business with you. The second thing that's important here is around the application of the regulations as standards, the essential requirements, which I talked about, or in the EU, they're called general safety performance requirements, but they're practically the same. They're a set of regulations that define the minimum expectations for the requirements of a self-test or a direct consumer test in the UK and in the EU. And most important is go read our guidance. If you are having a look at direct consumer testing, especially some very, very nuanced direct consumer testing, we have very specific guidance available to us at the MHRA. It's not just developing the test, it's also registering the test with us. And making sure that those tests are fit for purpose, but not just placing the test on the market using it, it's then monitoring the use of that test, which is what we call about post-market surveillance. Post-market surveillance tells us a little bit more about how the tests are used, how they're sold, what's the incidence that occurred, any misinformation, misdiagnosis that could result in someone having serious harm, taking medication or taking extra clinical intervention or other treatment options. So, please take our advice. There are 2 robotic hands pointing to a very important QR code, which is looking at our guidance here at the MHRA. I'd like to just conclude with some really key messages, 5 key messages that just highlights the importance of direct consumer test regulations. The first is they need to support awareness and give people ability to have prompt response to seek advice earlier. So it's important, some good tests that are going to be good for use, for example, pregnancy tests. There are good pregnancy tests out there, ovulation tests. They give people advice earlier, whether someone being pregnant or not, so they can take other interventions. Second is to take the position of the test in context of the patient and the user, what the test can and cannot do. Okay, they can and cannot do. The test must meet the right standards of performance and safety. Information must be reliable and accurate. I just want to touch on this word accurate at the end because it's actually a really interesting word, and I just want to differentiate it from some other words that we've used today. The information must be reliable and accurate, understandable to non-medical professionals. That's lay language. The information must be presented in the lay language, and the interpretation, the context, and continuity often over time establishes that trust relationship between yourself and the health critical information that's been presented by the test itself. These very important context, these 5 important elements develop the ability for tests to have good innovation, have trust, and the development of context for which the test is being used for. So let me just end with the word I started at the beginning, which was standard. So regulations are just standards. Can I just touch on one thing before I come back? Accuracy. Accuracy is a mislabeled name. Accuracy in regulation means repeatability and reproducibility. So they're not the same as sensitivity or specificity or positive predictive value. I encourage you, please go to that webpage. I gave a link to the QR code with the 2 hands of the robots. Have a look, there's some definitions there. So if you get to see the word accuracy, you need to translate that in your head as not sensitivity or specificity, but about reproducibility and repeatability. That's the technical definition of accuracy. Okay? So moving forward, you should, if someone says to you, I'm 99.9 accurate, you need to ask the next question, what's your sensitivity? What's your specificity? What's your negative predictive value? What's your positive predictive value? Okay, so just do that translation in your head straight away. Don't use accuracy as the basis of how well it can detect something or not. Okay, with that, I'm going to pass back to Helen. Thank you.